Under Pine Ridge's icy night, James Carter staggers out of a brutal shift, only to freeze under the chilling, amber stare of a tiny bobcat, watching, waiting, unyielding. It doesn't flee, doesn't flinch, just guards the hospital door like a sentinel hiding a dark, unspeakable truth. What's lurking in the shadows that even a hardened trauma doc can't foresee? Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. Thank you. The night clawed at James Carter's throat, a frigid beast of wind and shadow that sank its teeth into his bones as he stumbled out of Pine Ridge Hospital. The Colorado Rockies loomed like silent judges beyond the snow-draped town, their peaks swallowed by a sky so black it felt alive, pressing down, suffocating. His coat, thin, threadbare from years of late shifts, did little to shield him from the cold that sliced through the air, sharp as a scalpel. 14 hours in the trauma unit had left him hollow, his hands still trembling from the last patient's blood, the last flatline scream echoing in his skull. He just wanted his car, his keys, the hum of the heater, escape. But then, a sound, software too soft, a rustle, barely there, like a whisper trapped in the snow. James froze, his breath clouding in jagged bursts, his pulse hammering against the silence. He turned, slow, dread coiling in his gut. The parking lot stretched empty under the flickering sodium lights, their weak glow staining the fresh powder a sickly yellow. Nothing. Just the wind, he told himself, the lie bitter on his tongue. His boots crunched forward, each step a battle against the ice. And there it was again. Closer, sharper. A scrape, a shift, a presence. His eyes darted to the hospital's stone wall, where the shadows twisted like living things. And then he saw it. Two amber flames burning through the dark. Eyes, wild, unblinking, locked on him. James staggered back, his heel catching a slick patch, nearly sending him sprawling. A bobcat kitten, small, tufted ears quivering, fur dusted with frost, crouched against the wall, its gaze piercing, relentless. It didn't move, didn't growl, just stared, those golden orbs glowing with a quiet, terrifying intent. His chest tightened, breath shallow. Wild animals didn't do this. Not here, not so close to town, not sitting exposed like a sentinel outside a hospital, alive with chaos and death. "What the hell are you?" he rasped, voice cracking in the frozen air. The kitten blinked, slow, deliberate, a predator's calm, and shifted its stare back to the hospital doors, as if dismissing him, as if he were the intruder. James's skin prickled, a shiver racing up his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He'd seen bobcats before, fleeting ghosts in the woods, but this was wrong. Too still, too knowing, like it was waiting. For what? For who? His mind spun, exhaustion warring with a sudden, irrational fear. Was it hurt? Hungry? No. Its frame was thin, yes, but its posture was steady, purposeful. It wasn't lost. It was here. He took a step closer, heart pounding, the snow crunching louder than it should. "Hey, little one," he murmured, softer now, forcing calm into his tone. The kitten's head tilted, just a fraction, those eyes flicking back to him, assessing, weighing. James stopped, hands raised, palms out, a gesture of peace he wasn't sure it understood. Up close, he saw the frost clinging to its whiskers, the faint tremble in its limbs. Hunger, maybe. Cold, definitely. Against every shred of logic screaming in his head, he fumbled in his pocket, pulled out a protein bar, his last one, meant for the drive home. His fingers, numb and clumsy, tore the wrapper, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. He broke off half, tossed it gently a few feet away. The kitten didn't flinch, didn't lunge. It watched the offering hit the snow, then rose, graceful, silent, and padded forward. James held his breath, muscles taut, ready to bolt if those claws turned on him. But the bobcat only sniffed, then ate delicate bites, never breaking its eerie composure. When it finished, it didn't run, didn't beg for more. It turned, slipped back to its spot by the wall, and resumed its vigil, eyes locked on the glass doors where nurses and patients flickered like ghosts beyond the frost. James exhaled, a shaky plume of white curling into the dark. "You're not scared of me," he whispered, more to himself than the creature. "What are you waiting for?" The question hung there, unanswered, heavy as the mountains pressing in around them. He glanced at his watch. Midnight, the witching hour, the temperature plunging fast. Animal control, he thought. That's what he should do. Call them. Let them deal with this. But his feet wouldn't move. Something about that gaze, steady, patient, almost human, rooted him to the spot. It wasn't fear holding him now. It was something deeper, something he couldn't name. The wind howled, tugging at his coat, and he shivered, torn between the warmth of his car and the pull of those eyes. He'd seen death tonight, too much of it, the kind that clawed at his soul and left him empty. And now this, a wild thing, small and fierce, staring into the heart of a place built to defy nature's cruelty. Was it a sign? A warning? His mind raced, chasing shadows of meaning he couldn't grasp. "I'll check on you tomorrow," he said finally, voice barely audible, a promise he didn't know why he made. He turned, forcing himself toward the car, but the weight of that gaze followed him, burning, unyielding, a riddle carved in frost. Behind the wheel, heat blasting, James gripped the steering column, his knuckles white. He glanced back through the windshield, half expecting the kitten to be gone, a trick of his tired mind. But no, it was still there, a lone silhouette against the hospital's glow, watching, waiting. The engine rumbled to life, but sleep wouldn't come tonight. Not with those amber eyes branded into his thoughts, whispering secrets he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. Tomorrow he'd face it again. Tomorrow he'd have to know. James didn't sleep. The amber eyes of that bobcat kitten burned behind his lids, twin flames flickering in the dark of his cramped apartment, chasing him through restless hours. The clock mocked him. 3 a.m., 4 a.m., dawn bleeding gray through the blinds. And still, he saw it, that small, frost-dusted figure, crouched like a phantom against the hospital wall. Waiting, always waiting. By the time he dragged himself back to Pine Ridge Hospital for his next shift, exhaustion clung to him like damp snow, heavy and cold. But beneath it, something else simmered, a gnawing need, sharp as a blade to understand. The day crawled by in a blur of blood and chaos, broken bones, a car wreck victim's screams, the antiseptic sting of the trauma unit. But his mind wasn't there. It was outside with it, with the kitten he couldn't shake. As evening fell, the sky bruising purple over the Rockies, James took the same exit, his boots crunching through the snow with purpose. His breath caught as he rounded the corner. There it was, same spot, same wall, same unblinking stare fixed on the glass doors. Relief hit him first, irrational and fierce, followed by a shiver of dread. It hadn't left. It wouldn't leave. "You again," he muttered, voice rough, his throat tight with something he couldn't name. The kitten's ears flicked, a tiny acknowledgement, but those eyes didn't waver. Golden, steady, pulling him in like a tide. He'd come prepared this time, a plastic container of water and a can of cat food tucked under his arm, pilfered from a corner store on his break. He set them down, careful, a safe distance away, his hands trembling not from the cold but from the weight of its gaze. The kitten moved, slow, deliberate, drank deep, ate quickly, then slid back to its post. A ritual now, unspoken, binding them across the icy divide. Night after night it went like this. 5 evenings of shadowed vigils, 5 offerings of food and water, 5 times watching that small, wild thing settle back into its silent watch. James stopped calling it coincidence, stopped pretending it was just a stray. It was a mystery clawing at him, sinking teeth into the hollow spaces he'd carved out over years of stitching bodies back together, only to lose them anyway. In the quiet moments, between surgeries and the cafeteria's hum, he caught himself sketching those eyes on napkins, tracing the question they held. What did it want? Why here? Why now? On the sixth night, the storm came, furious, howling, a beast of snow and wind that tore through Pine Ridge like it meant to bury it alive. James arrived early, a makeshift shelter in his arms, plastic and thermal blankets, a clumsy shield against the blizzard. The kitten was already there, a dark smudge against the white, its fur crusted with ice, its body hunched against the gale. "You'll die out here," he said, voice cracking, desperation bleeding through. He set the shelter down, retreated, watched as it crept inside, cautious, wary, but alive. Those eyes still burned, still fixed on the hospital, even as the storm raged. He almost didn't see her. Emily Harper, night nurse, her scrubs a flash of blue against the snow. She stumbled into him, her gasp swallowed by the wind. "Jesus, James!" she yelped, clutching his arm. Her eyes followed his, widened. "Is that a bobcat?" He nodded, numb. "A kitten. Been here every night. Almost a week." Emily frowned, her breath puffing white. "That's not normal. Wild things don't linger like that. Not without a reason." Her words struck him, cold and true, echoing the unease he'd carried since that first night. "I know," he said, quieter. "It's waiting. I just don't know for what." Emily's gaze softened, but her voice stayed firm. "You're a softie, James. Always have been. That coyote with 3 legs last year. Remember?" He forced a smile, thin and brittle. "This isn't like that. This feels bigger, like it's pulling me somewhere." She studied him, snow catching in her hair, then sighed. "Be careful. Even kittens have claws." She left him there, her warning ringing in his ears, but he couldn't turn away. Not from this. Days bled into weeks, and the bobcat, Leo he'd started calling it, the name slipping out unbidden, became his shadow, his secret. He'd linger before shifts, watching it emerge from the shelter as dusk fell, its movements fluid, its purpose unshaken. One evening, he arrived with food and found her, an old woman, bent and weathered, kneeling near Leo, her voice a low murmur against the wind. "Ma'am," he called, gentle but firm. "That's a wild animal. You shouldn't—" She turned, her face a map of grief and warmth, eyes sharp despite the years. "I know what he is," she said, raspy, steady. "He's Henry's little shadow." The name hit him like a punch. "Henry." "Who?" he asked, stepping closer, the food container forgotten in his hands. She rose, slow, joints creaking. "Henry Grayson, my neighbor. Died here, in that hospital, a month back." James's pulse quickened, pieces snapping together, jagged and incomplete. "Leo," she said, nodding at the kitten, confirming the name he'd somehow known. "Henry found him last spring, half dead after a storm took his den. Raised him, loved him." Her voice broke, soft but heavy. "Cancer got Henry, pancreatic. Too late to fight. He came here at the end." James stared at Leo, the kitten now nosing the food he'd set down, and felt the ground shift beneath him. "He's waiting for Henry," he whispered, the realization a blade in his chest. Clara, her name she'd said, nodded, eyes glistening. "Animals know things we don't. Henry always said that. Leo bonded with him. And now—" She trailed off, wiping her face. "He's been here every night?" James asked, voice thick. "Maybe," she shrugged. "Saw him today by chance. But it fits. They were everything to each other. The wind stilled, the world shrinking to just them. James, Clara, Leo, and the weight of a story he hadn't asked for. Henry's ghost lingered in her words, a man who'd faced death alone, leaving behind this wild, grieving thing. James crouched, watching Leo settle back into his vigil, those amber eyes unyielding. "He's not coming back, Leo," he murmured, the words tasting of ash. But Leo didn't flinch, didn't falter, and James knew this wasn't over. Not for Leo, not for him. That night, lying awake again, James saw more than eyes in the dark. He saw Henry, faceless, fading, reaching for a kitten who wouldn't let go. And he felt it, deep in his bones. A call, a pull, a whisper from the past he couldn't ignore. Tomorrow he'd dig deeper. Tomorrow he'd face whatever Leo was guarding. James couldn't outrun it anymore. The pull, the weight, the whisper of Leo's amber eyes searing through his every waking moment. Sleep was a stranger now, his nights haunted by that small, wild silhouette against the hospital wall, by Clara's raspy voice weaving Henry's ghost into his bones. Work didn't dull it. Sutures, screams, the steady beep of monitors, all faded beneath the question gnawing at him. Why? Why Leo waited? Why it mattered? Why he cared so damn much? By the time his shift ended, the sky over Pine Ridge hung low and leaden, snowflakes spitting from the clouds like shards of glass. He didn't go home. He couldn't. The address burned in his mind. Henry Grayson's, pulled from hospital records he'd no right to touch. Ethics be damned. This wasn't about rules anymore. It was about answers. His old Jeep rattled down the winding road, tires crunching through fresh powder, the Rockies looming like silent sentinels in the dusk. The cabin emerged at the end of a long, snaking driveway, pine-shadowed, weathered, a relic clinging to the mountainside. A for sale by estate sign tilted in the wind, its edges chewed by frost. No family, Clara had said, just Henry and Leo. James killed the engine, the silence crashing in, thick, oppressive, broken only by the hiss of snow against the windshield. His breath fogged the glass, heart thudding loud enough to drown out reason. What am I doing? The question clawed at him, but his hand was already on the door, boots sinking into the snow as he stepped out. The air bit his lungs, sharp and pine-scented, the cabin staring back at him with dark, empty windows. He shouldn't be here. He knew it. Trespassing, stupid, dangerous, a line he'd never crossed. But Leo's eyes, Henry's shadow, they dragged him forward, relentless. He circled the cabin, snow swallowing his tracks, searching for a way in. The door was locked, solid oak unyielding under his grip. His fingers, numb and fumbling, brushed a decorative stone by the porch steps. Too perfect, too placed. He lifted it, breath hitching as a key glinted in the fading light. A rural trick, a risk Henry had taken. James's pulse raced, guilt and thrill tangling in his chest. He shouldn't. He had to. The key turned with a groan, the door creaking open into a tomb of stillness. "Hello?" he called, voice trembling, knowing no one would answer, knowing he wasn't alone. Inside, time had stopped. Dust motes danced in the slivers of gray light piercing the windows, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and solitude. A living room, worn couch, sagging bookshelves stuffed with wildlife tomes, photos of a grizzled man in forests and mountains. Henry. James's throat tightened, the man's face sharpening into focus, lined, kind, alone. He moved deeper, each step a violation, a prayer. The kitchen held a stack of unopened mail, a notebook splayed on the counter like an offering. His hands shook as he touched it, flipped it open. Henry's handwriting, tight and precise, spilling secrets across the pages. Leo explored the clearing today. The first entry read, "Confidence growing. Pounced on a squirrel, instinct sharp. Still comes when I whistle, preparing him for when I'm gone." James's chest ached, the words a lifeline to a man he'd never met. Pages turned, the tone shifting, darker, heavier, pain worse today. Watched Leo climb while I sat, useless. He's almost ready, but I won't be here. Clara promised to check, but it's not enough. He needs the wild. The final entry, scrawled, faint, cut deepest. Can't write much. Hospital tomorrow. Leo stayed by my bed all night. Hardest part is leaving him. He deserves his freedom. Hope someone helps him. James sank into a chair, the notebook trembling in his grip, tears pricking hot and unbidden. Henry's voice, raw, fading, echoed in the dimness, a plea from beyond the grave. Leo wasn't just waiting, he was grieving, lost, trapped by a bond too strong to break, too cruel to fulfill. The cabin pressed in, walls whispering of a life cut short, a purpose unfinished. James wiped his face, guilt surging. He'd broken in, rifled through a dead man's soul. But beneath it something else flared. Resolve, fierce and sudden. Henry's hope, Leo's need. His hands steadied as he searched further, driven now, reckless. A small room off the kitchen stopped him cold. Leo's space. A nest of blankets, climbing logs, a whistle dangling from a hook. On a desk, a folder. Leo's release plan. James's breath caught as he opened it. Maps, timelines, a meticulous blueprint for setting Leo free. A release site marked in red, 20 miles out. Protected land, wild and untouched. Letters to wildlife centers, unsent, yellowed at the edges. Henry had planned it all, every step, every hope, until cancer stole his time. James clutched the folder, the journal, his mind racing. This was it. The why, the how, the what now. Leo wasn't just a mystery, he was a promise. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the cabin like a warning. James froze, the key heavy in his pocket, the weight of his trespass crashing down. What if someone saw? What if the estate came? His heart pounded, boots scuffing the floor as he bolted for the door, clutching Henry's words like stolen gold. He locked it, hid the key, stumbled to the Jeep through deepening snow, breathless, alive, terrified. The engine roared, headlights slicing the dark, but the cabin's shadow clung to him, Henry's voice loud in his skull. Help him. Back at the hospital, Leo waited, small, fierce amber eyes glinting from the shelter. James parked, stared, the folder burning a hole in his lap. You're not alone anymore, he whispered, voice thick with something new. Purpose maybe, or penance. He'd crossed a line tonight, stepped into a dead man's life, and there was no going back. Tomorrow he'd act. Tomorrow he'd fight for Leo, for Henry, for whatever this was tearing him apart to become. James clutched Henry's folder like a lifeline, its edges digging into his palms as he sped through Pine Ridge's dawn-lit streets. Sleep hadn't come, again, just the echo of Henry's scrawl, help him, pounding in his skull. Leo's eyes haunted him, fierce and pleading, a tether he couldn't cut. He'd crossed lines, hospital records, a dead man's cabin, and now there was no retreat. Only this, a promise to a ghost, a wild thing's freedom hanging in the balance. He dialed Sophie Navarro, wildlife vet, voice tight. I've got a plan, Henry's plan. Can you help? Her paws crackled through the line then. Meet me at the hospital. Bring everything. She was there by sunrise, tall, sharp-eyed, a transport crate slung over her shoulder. James spilled it all, Leo's vigil, Henry's notes, the release site mapped in red. Sophie's brow furrowed, but her nod was firm. Unusual as hell, but if Henry prepped him right, we can finish it. Soft release, enclosure first, then freedom. Her voice steadied him, a lifeline in the chaos spinning inside. They worked fast, phone calls, permits, a temporary pen set up 20 miles out, Henry's Valley. James barely breathed, hands shaking as he packed the Jeep with food, the whistle, the weight of it all. Night fell, snow swirling, and Leo waited, amber eyes glinting from the shelter, wary but alive. James blew the whistle, shrill, piercing, and Leo patted closer, nose twitching. Time to go, buddy, he rasped, throat raw. Sophie moved in, crate ready. Leo hissed, claws flashing, a wild spark flaring. James froze, heart slamming, then softened his tone. It's okay. For Henry, Leo stilled, eyes locked on his, and slipped inside. The latch clicked. Done. They had him. First stop, the cemetery. James's idea, reckless, insane. But he couldn't let Leo go without this. Sophie frowned, snow dusting her coat. You sure? Stress could? He needs it, James cut in, voice breaking. Henry deserves it. She relented and they drove, the crate rattling soft in the back. Pine Ridge Cemetery loomed, gray stones jagged against the white. Henry's grave, a quiet wound in the earth. James knelt, snow-soaking his jeans, and slid open the crate's viewing panel. Leo's eyes flared, wild, searching, nostrils flaring at the scent of frost and decay. He's here, Leo, James whispered, tears stinging. We're taking you home. Leo shifted, a low growl rumbling, then silence. His gaze fixed on the headstone, steady, knowing. James's chest cracked open. Grief, awe, a bond he'd never touch. Footsteps crunched behind. He turned. Doctor, Brooks, oncologist, bouquet of greens trembling in his hands. "Henry's patient," Brooks said, voice thick. "Spoke of that Bobcat every day." James nodded, words failing. "He's going free. Henry's plan." Brooks knelt, peering at Leo, eyes wet. 15 years of this job, and this breaks me." A wooden bobcat carving hit the snow, a gift from Henry's dying hands. No time to linger. The valley called Henry's Valley, wild, untouched, a fortress of pine and stone. Sophie's team had the enclosure ready, sprawling, rigged with food puzzles, a test of Leo's instincts. James carried the crate, legs leaden, heart racing. "Ready?" Sophie asked, voice low. He wasn't, couldn't be, but he nodded. The crate opened. Leo exploded out. Tawny blur, claws scraping, then stopped, sniffed, stared. James whistled, short, sharp. Leo turned, eyes meeting his, a flicker of something. Trust, goodbye, then bounded to a perch, surveying his new world. Weeks blurred, frantic, fierce. James and Sophie trekked daily, snow biting their faces, watching Leo hunt, adapt, grow. Supplemental food dwindled. Rabbits fell to his claws instead. "He's ready," Sophie said one dusk, her breath a white plume. "Tomorrow." Final release. James's stomach dropped, relief warring with loss. Leo wasn't his, never was, but letting go hurt, a blade twisting deep. He nodded mute and drove home, the whistle heavy in his pocket, Henry's words loud. He deserves his wildlife. Sunrise broke cold, crisp, snowflakes dancing as James hiked in with Sophie's crew. The enclosure loomed, Leo atop his perch, alert, regal, a king of the wild now. "No ceremony," Sophie warned, voice clipped. "Open it, step back." A specialist slid the door, silent, final. James held his breath, chest tight, eyes locked on Leo. Nothing. Minutes bled. 10, 20, 40. Leo preened, stretched, ignored the gap. Doubt clawed James. Will he stay? Then, light. Sun pierced the clouds, gold spilling over the forest. Leo leapt, graceful, sudden, landing at the threshold. Nose flared, eyes swept. James's tears welled, hot, unstoppable. Leo stepped out, one paw, two, then paused, turned, looked back, straight at him. A heartbeat, long, eternal. Then Leo bolted. A streak of fur, a ghost in the trees, gone. James choked, knees buckling, snow swallowing his sobs. Free. Leo was free. Henry's dream, alive, wild, tearing through the deep woods. Sophie's hand gripped his shoulder. "He'll make it," she said, voice unsteady. "He's strong." James nodded, wiping his face, the whistle cold against his skin. Leo was gone, his vigil, his weight, his bond, swallowed by the forest. But the ache lingered, sharp and sweet, a wound he'd carry forever. Henry's promise kept, Leo's life begun, and James, changed, broken whole, stood in the silence, the wild calling him back. The forest swallowed Leo whole, his tawny shadow vanishing into the pines as James stood frozen, snow soaking his knees, tears cutting tracks down his wind-burned face. The silence roared, deafening, vast, after that final, fleeting glance from those amber eyes. Gone, free, a promise kept. But the hole it left gnawed at him, raw and jagged, as he stumbled back to the Jeep with Sophie's quiet assurances trailing behind. "He'll thrive," she'd said, her voice a lifeline he clung to through the haze. He drove home, the whistle in his pocket a cold, heavy relic. Henry's, Leo's, now his. Sleep came then, fitful, dreamless, a mercy after weeks of fire. Days stretched into weeks, the winter loosening its grip on Pine Ridge. Snowmelt trickled down the Rockies, the air softening with hints of earth and pine. James returned to the trauma unit, sutures, shouts, the endless dance with death. But something had shifted. The weight he'd carried, that crushing load of lives lost, felt lighter, pierced by a strange, quiet clarity. Leo haunted him still. Not the kitten by the hospital, but the wild thing bounding free, Henry's ghost riding his shadow. Sophie's updates trickled in. Texts, photos from trail cams. Leo hunting, sleek and fierce. A bobcat born anew. Each image stung, a bitter-sweet ache, proof of life beyond the vigil. One morning, late January, her call came. "He's independent," she said, voice bright through the static. "Caught a hare yesterday. No food from us in days, he's done it." James leaned against his desk, hospital chaos muted around him, and closed his eyes. Done. Over. Leo didn't need him, didn't need anyone. The whistle sat on his desk, untouched since that dawn, its silver dulled by time. "Thanks, Sophie," he managed, throat tight. "For everything." She paused. "You should see him. One last time. Closure." Closure. The word lingered, heavy, a door he wasn't ready to shut. He didn't go back. Not yet. Work swallowed him, the rhythm of emergencies a shield against the quiet. But Leo's face, those eyes followed him, a shadow stitched into his soul. Then spring crept in, wildflowers clawing through the frost. And James found himself at the cemetery again. Henry's grave glowed under the sun, petals scattered like offerings across the stone. Dr. Brooks was there, gray hair catching the light, a small plaque in his hands. Friend to wild things. "Thought it fit," Brooks said, voice soft. "You made it happen, James." His dream. James nodded, words stuck, the carving of the bobcat still resting where Brooks had left it months ago. They stood in silence, the spring breeze whispering through the pines, and James felt it. Henry's peace, Leo's freedom, a thread tying them all. "He faced death better than most," Brooks murmured, eyes distant. "Said Leo gave him purpose. You gave Leo his life." James swallowed, the lump in his throat sharp. "I didn't do it alone." Brooks smiled, faint, and left the plaque gleaming against the earth. A tribute, a marker, a bridge between worlds. Weeks later, Sophie texted. A single photo. Leo, mid-stride, caught by a remote camera in the valley. Muscles rippled under his coat, eyes sharp, alive. A predator owning his realm. James stared, breath shallow, then printed it, small, simple, framed on his desk. When the trauma unit pressed too hard, blood, panic, loss, he'd glance at it, grounding himself in that wild, untamed spark. Leo lived. Henry's hope lived. And somehow he did too. Healed, not whole, but steady in a way he hadn't been before. One spring dusk, he drove out, alone, unbidden, to the release site. The valley sprawled golden under the setting sun, pines swaying, a chorus of unseen life humming in the air. He parked, hiked in, boots sinking into soft earth, the whistle dangling from his neck now, a talisman. No enclosure remained, just forest, vast and wild, Leo's kingdom. James stood at the edge, chest tight, and blew it. One sharp note, echoing through the trees. Nothing. Silence. He waited, breath held, eyes scanning the shadows. A rustle, soft, fleeting, pricked his ears. His heart leapt, foolish hope surging. "Leo," he whispered, voice trembling. A deer stepped out, froze, then bolted, and James laughed. Quiet, broken, the sound swallowed by the woods. Leo wouldn't come. Didn't need to. He was out there, free, fierce, a piece of Henry's soul woven into the wild. James turned back, the whistle warm against his skin, and drove home under a sky streaked with fire. Back at his desk, the photo glowed in the lamplight. Leo, forever moving, forever gone. James traced its edges, a question flickering, unanswered. Did Leo remember Henry? Did he feel the bond, even now in the deep woods? Or had freedom erased it all, a clean slate of instinct and survival? He didn't know, might never know. But the ache, the sweet, lingering sting, told him something truer. Leo had changed him. Henry had changed him, a chain of care, wild and human, stretching beyond graves and forests, echoing in the spring light. He leaned back, eyes drifting to the ceiling, and let the mystery settle. Unresolved, alive, a whisper he'd carry always. Somewhere out there, Leo ran, and James smiled, faint and real, at the thought of it. And so, Leo's journey ends under the soft glow of spring light. But this story, this tale of a bond that defies the line between human and wild, lives on in our hearts. James found a new spark in his weary life. Leo claimed the freedom he was born for, and Henry, though gone, left behind a legacy carried by that little bobcat's fierce spirit. Isn't it wild to think about? The connections out there, waiting to be uncovered. Quiet, powerful moments that shake us to our core if we just stop to look. Maybe that's the real magic here. Not just what we see, but what it makes us feel. If this story touched you, hit that like button to let us know. And if you're hungry for more heartfelt tales, more mysteries of life, then subscribe to our YouTube channel right now. Click that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a single video. Together, we'll keep chasing the wonders of this world, one story at a time. See you in the next one.